So, we have a lot of youth actually with us today. So if you are joining us and no one has met you yet and you're just brand on this campus, could you please stand? We have a lot of, some new faculty, not all of us. We have 13 new faculty on ECPS. So, there we go. So, we'll start with Francis. Do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Panuska, and I am a graduate faculty specialist position in the Counseling and Human Services Department.
Wonderful.
Julie Guzman, I'm a faculty specialist with occupational therapy.
I'm Chen.
Thank you. Let's give them a big hand. Because we also have our newly created team under the interim associate provost, Patricia Harrington. And would you introduce your team?
Hi everybody, this is a great turnout. I don't want from college.
Too bad you're not part of it. Traitor! You went to the dark side.
The good news is that the Office of Educational Assessment is going to be located in O'Hara Hall. So it won't be too far away. And I'm really happy about the work that we've done so far this spring semester, and thank everybody in this room for participating in the assessment of outcomes and the inclusion of them. And of course, so like not that you had to add them because CPS was right there all the time. But I saw Deborah encouraging you to ramp it up, and there's a lot of good things going on. So thank you for that. We have a director of educational assessment, Mary Jane DiMatteo from Nursing. And then there are 5 faculty fellows, and you may have seen some of these invitations on email for you to apply to be a faculty fellow. And the representation is 1 from PCPS, 1 from KSOM, and 3 from CAS to be representative of the number of faculty in each college. So from CAS, it's Dr. Linda Ledford-Miller. She's in world languages, and she's got a lot of assessment experience under her belt. John Diak is from chemistry. John has also been involved in assessment over the last many years. And then the last one, Harry's not here yet, right?
Not yet.
Harry Jammer is running a little late, an errand, and he'll arrive later. Maybe he was so quiet that you won't know he's here. So you'll know when Harry arrives. Okay, Harry's in the Criminal Justice Department, and he's the 3rd fellow from PCPS. John and Linda have been working on this since November. Since we got the middle state warning, the president included them to take the lead and be faculty fellows. Then from PCPS, we have Vanessa Tellerico. Vanessa's from the Education Department, and she also has experience with accreditation and with the pilot of TaskStream, which is a software platform which we're going to need to purchase either TaskStream or another product, and that's our goal as well, is to look at those products and to get the best one for what we need it for. And then, finally, is KSOM at Satyajit Village. Satyajit has experience with assessment. KSOM is also, one of the leaders on campus in assessment because of the requirements for the business school, and he's been involved economics, right? Economics department, and he's been involved in accreditation and review in that college. So we have an excellent team. It's a group of people who tell it like it is, and they also respect everybody else's opinions, and it's really fun working with them. They do, and it's a really good team that came together. And Mary Belchman is one of our major consultants. Mary from
CTLE.
And Mary has set up some programs that you may have seen advertisements at the provost office for summer help and getting the courses together. So there's a lot ahead of us in the fall, and I know that PCPS will be behind us every way. Thank you so much.
Our faculty and professional staff and clerical from different departments. So if you are from an ACO group, the occupational therapy department, would you please stand? It's not in alphabetical order. If you are from exercise science and community health education, would you please stand? Services, which you are K-Craft, Core, and how many names?
CSHSE.
That's wrong. Would you please stand? If you are from Health of Men and Human Resources, so you are Cami and Sherm and that long, the other one, where's Dan West? Help us out, stand up. You are from nursing, ACNE, and any other? Yeah, CCNE, stand up. And let's see, if you are from CAPTI, our physical therapist or DPT faculty and staff team, stand. We have a special person with us. Go ahead.
The Office of Assessment is being helped out from an analyst perspective by Richard Walsh.
Richard Walsh. If you are from academic services, and watch out for our students, undergrads, every day, would you please see? Now, if you are our wonderful clerical PCPS Dean's Office and our wonderful clerical staff, would you please look back there? Not to make you jealous or not, but they are going out later for mimosas and how to do their own workshop on how to save the university money, which should be very interesting. If you are from the Leahy Community Health and Family Center, would you please stand? Human Resources, SHRM, standards, I did that already. Okay, I think we got everyone, right? Good, yes. All right, and if you're Associate Dean, PCS Dean's Office. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you from sunny Florida, who's going to have a wonderful University of Scranton present. But Diane Postgate and I were at a conference, a beautiful weekend conference in winter Indianapolis, Indiana, and we were to this wonderful panel, and we both looked at each other and we said, we have to bring him in for our assessment retreat. Dr. Lance Tomei, and his bio is very extensive from the University of Southern Florida. But what's really impressive is you're only allowed to be the director of the university's Office of Educational Assessment for a 2-year term, correct? And the president said, we want you back. And I will let him read his credentials to you and without further ado. So basically this morning is Lance for a brief overview workshop talking about our assessment plan, a workshop that he's handed, and then we have lunch, and then you're free to go, and then Pat Harrington's group will take over for the afternoon. So Lance, from beautiful, it is always sunny in spring.
I think it's this one here.
While we're getting, that might too loud here. How's that? Better? Okay, while we're getting the computer set up, a quick disclaimer. I had cataract surgery 3 days ago, and my eye is still adjusting to this new artificial lens they put in. If you see me tearing up, it's not that talking about assessment makes me tear. It's just my eye still adjusting to the new artificial lens in there. And 2 things that you need to know about me. You'll see a slide that has a lot of my current activities on there. I'm not going to keep that up there for more than a second or 2. But I come from a military background. I did a career in the Air Force. I was an intelligence officer. I served 21 years before I went into higher ed. And late in my career, I was involved in intelligence training operations. At one point, double mics. At one point, I was a squadron commander at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. If you're familiar with that facility, arguably the best language training facility in the world, certainly in our country. And very much like higher ed, so that's kind of how I think I wound up after the Air Force, heading in that direction as well. But in the military, when we built a training system or redesigned one, we always started by establishing the target learning outcomes. What is it that we needed the completers of that training program to know and be able to do at the end? So I grew up in a world where we reverse engineered everything in the way of education. So I've been doing that for almost 4 decades now. So that's where I came from. And you need to understand that that shaped how I think about this process in higher ed. 20 years ago, I might not have fit in as well as I do today, I think, because today, I think we're all in the same boat of understanding how important it is to have that end game in sight when you start building or refining educational programs. In higher ed, my entire career was involved in assessment, accreditation, accountability types of things. So what I believe about this is what I've learned through what we call military on-the-job training. Experience that I had both with a college of education, where I served as the director for assessment, accreditation, and data management, and chairing the University Assessment Committee for about a total of 4 years, 2 separate 2-year terms with a 2-year break in between. I was on that committee for 8 years, so I've done university level assessment, familiar with regional accreditation requirements, continuous quality improvement, institutional effectiveness, the buzzwords that we all hear. And I'll talk a little bit about that and share with you what I've learned over the years and how to make this all work, because I think everybody continues to struggle to some degree with how do we do assessment effectively. So, and I don't think anybody has all the answers right now. I'll talk a lot about rubrics today. The workshop is focused on rubrics. I'll share with you that I don't think I've ever seen a perfect rubric, and I don't know that there will ever be one, because I don't think you can do perfect assessment. You'll never be able to measure everything that someone knows and is able to do, so we try and do the best job we can. Okay, that's the 2-second slide. I do stay actively engaged. I serve on 2 state-level education committees in Florida, and I'm on the technical advisory committee for the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So, we called it ISD in the military. I think it's still a valid approach to building an effective educational system now. The reason I put that first item in bold is because I have to tell you, I got a chance to read your new assessment plan. I've worked with about 12 institutions of higher ed in a little over a year since I retired from UCF in a consulting role. And in most cases, I'm going in and taking a look at their overall assessment system, either within the College of Education or at the university level, and trying to help them refine that system, doing a SWOT analysis, if you will. I know you use that term here as well, to help them figure out where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, opportunities and threats to their overall system. I've also done a fairly large number of national accreditation visits for formerly NCATE, now CATE, where I'm a team leader, and I head those accreditation teams, and I've headed teams in Florida as well. So I've gone in as an inspector, if you will, or auditor type role to a lot of institutions. I will tell you, I have never seen a better array of program level learning outcomes than what you have put into your assessment plan. So kudos to you. That's where you have to start, and you already are there. You've got that right. That's the fundamental building block of this whole process, is knowing what the end game is for your students. So the fact that you've established good, solid target learning outcomes puts you ahead of the majority of institutions that I've been to. So for that, you're in good shape. Because of that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about assessment system design, because I think you're already on the right track. That's not where you need me to focus my time today. I think the rubric's the piece that we need to spend the most time about. I will just briefly walk you through this. So once you've got those target learning outcomes, the next question is, how do you know they're there? How do you know your students have gotten where you want them to be? And so you have to come up with that array of authentic summative assessments that will give you a high level of confidence that they acquired the competencies that you wanted them to acquire. They have the knowledge and skills that they should have at program exit. Once you know that, then you begin to reverse engineer that curricular design. You have to figure out how we get them there. What are those enabling knowledges and skills that will get them to the finish line? And what's the order? How do we present that in a logical sequence? Along the way, you also have to check that they're on track, and that's where formative assessment comes into place. So you have to have a good array of key formative assessments. Now, when you talk about accountability, you do this all the time, by the way. You know that in your courses, you're always monitoring how your students are performing, and you're using that information to positively impact on their learning outcomes. But from a program perspective and from an accountability perspective, it's important that you have identified key assignments, key assessments associated with those. Another term that people often use is signature assignments and assessments. What most accountability agencies, different accreditation firms, CAPE is a good example, what they expect is at least one major formative assessment for all of the competencies, and then an array of summative assessments. So those have to be well articulated, and there's a couple of simple rules. When you add up all your key formative assessments, they've got to comprehensively address all of those learning outcomes. You want to be able to gauge, are our students on track? Are they making the right degree of progress? And you have to determine at what point in time you're going to do that check, because that's going to tell you what your expectations should be at that point in terms of what they should know and be able to do. You can't have the same expectations that you're going to have on your summative assessments halfway through the program. So it's figuring that out, identifying those key formative assessments becomes a key and sometimes the most challenging piece. One way that you can put this all in perspective is to come up with a system of curriculum and assessment maps. And again, I've seen that terminology used already. I know you're involved in that process. There are some additional benefits, lots of different formats that you can use for curriculum and assessment maps. I'll share a design similar to what I used at the University of Central Florida where I worked. This documents where the competencies are taught and assessed. And we have to do that in Florida. We have a State Department of Education that tends to be very intrusive, particularly in our educator preparation programs. But there are some other benefits here because it gives you a program level perspective, and it helps you do some other things that are important, like balance faculty workload. You don't want a handful of faculty to have to be responsible for all of the key assessments in a program, because it is some extra work. We all recognize that. There's some extra effort involved in this. It's a great way to make sure that you have comprehensive coverage, both formatively and summatively, of all your key learning outcomes, all your competencies. It gives you a foundation for course syllabi. So if you're developing course syllabi, once you have this map, you'll know what the learning objectives for a particular course, what the required ones are. And it helps you come up with those core syllabi to ensure good consistency. And it provides a framework for faculty discussions on where should our key formative assessments be and what should they look like. So this is a very abbreviated version. I used a simple Excel spreadsheet. The competencies, each row has a competency, and you can't see, I apologize, the headers are hard to see on there because it's in white. But there's a column for each course, and in some cases you may have a non-course-based key assessment. You use Praxis here for your certification examination, the content area in your educator prep. So that would be a column in and of itself where you would capture that. And what you see on here is just a list of the formative assessments, and they're numbered one up for the whole program, F1, F2, F3. And then the summative assessments. This depicts a linear approach. You've got one formative assessment for each separate major competency. That's not the way you have to do this. There's a nonlinear way you can go about this as well, where you may have some very powerful assessments that cover a number of competencies, in which case you'd see that F1 show up multiple places in that same column. So this is just a way that you can kind of capture, and X is you're introducing a concept, and R is you're reinforcing the concept, but you can see how quickly you can look down and make sure that as you look across any one competency, you have to see at least one F something and one S something there, so that you know you have those key pieces in place. You can also get a sense when you look down the columns of how the courses are sharing the workload of these key assessments across the program. So that's the piece that lets you help balance the faculty workload component of this. So this is one way to go, not the only way to go. There's lots of different ways that you can do this. It's important somehow to capture that. It's a program level management tool. Now I will tell you that in Florida we were primarily responsive to state standards, and that diagram for elementary education, which in Florida has to include reading endorsement, it has to include ESOL endorsement. We had about 450 competencies, 450 rows of learning outcomes for that program. So if you don't have a tool, this looks simple, you know, but if you don't have a tool that gets you to where you need to be in terms of making sure that you really have that rigor and that comprehensive coverage, because it's not just about the competencies. One of the tricks to this, to doing this work well, is once you identify a learning outcome, you've got that. The next question you probably want to ask yourself is, what are the critical indicators for that competency? What are the things that we must, as faculty, see that our students know and are able to do before we're willing to say that they're where we want them to be? So coming up with that array of critical indicators, I'll use that term, for each competency is the key to how you build rubrics and what you're going to look at when you're assessing that competency. And that is often the toughest work here for faculty. And by the way, faculty have to own this. Okay? And the faculty who really have to lead the charge are your most knowledgeable, most expert faculty in the fields, because you want to have construct and content validity in your key assessment instruments. So you need your best expertise helping you figure out what should we be assessing with regard to this competency. I had the most difficult time at UCF getting our faculty. I tried putting them in committees to get this work done. That was an abysmal failure. I tried working with a lead faculty, and we could get consensus, but then that faculty member would go back to the faculty within a program and couldn't get the program to agree that we had captured the right things. So I finally came up with a different way to go about this. And faculty, I don't think, ever realized that they were doing assessment work at the time, but they were. I actually created a survey. And in Florida, we had state indicators, sample indicators for all of our standards, 2 different sets in 2 different state documents. So I amassed all of those for all of, at that time, the 12 state standards in Florida, and I sent it out to all faculty as a survey, all faculty in the college, and said, give me your top 3, the top 3 must-sees of all of these sample indicators for this standard and this standard and this standard. And by the way, if you have more than 3, if you absolutely have to see 4 or 5, fine, give me that. If there's another indicator that you think is important that's nowhere on the state list, write it in. And then I just assembled the survey data, and that's how we came up with our critical indicators. Once I could show faculty collectively that this is your decision, here are the top 3, here are the top 4, however that fell out for each of those competencies. So we got over that hurdle by using a survey approach with faculty. You have to have a minimum manageable number of robust key formative and summative assessments, and keep it manageable. One of the things that people do wrong in this whole process, I think, is create too many signature assessments, and they wind up suffering from what I call accountability exhaustion. It just gets to be too much work. I had one program, and we had 12 standards, so even a linear approach where you're going to do a key formative assessment and a key summative separately for each standard, that's 24, right, total. You can do key assessments that cover more than one competency if you use a nonlinear approach and you're using really robust types of assessments. Most of you probably have some type of a capstone summative project, student teaching for educator preparation, where you're looking across almost the full spectrum of standards, and that's a very powerful tool to use as one of your key summatives. So you don't even have to have that linear approach. You can be more efficient than that. And yet I had a program that their first go-around came at me with 68 key formative assessments alone. And then came back after one semester and said, this is way too much work. And I just looked at them and said, it's a self-inflicted wound. You didn't have to go there. And they revised their entire program and cut it down to about 20. So that's where they should have been to start with, probably even less than that, but it was a far cry better than the 68, that first attempt that they made to make this manageable. Big questions when you're doing this work. Do you want to allow self-selected or directed artifacts? Faculty like to give students the freedom to do self-selected artifacts in many cases, but you run into problems with that because of the last bullet on this slide. If you have key assessments, you need to make sure that whatever artifact or activity you're going to be observing or evaluating using that assessment instrument, you have to make sure that all of the criteria that are going to be evaluated are present in that artifact or activity that you're going to assess. And if you use self-selected artifacts, sometimes that fit is not there, and it really creates problems. How many of you are familiar with the AAC new value rubrics? Okay. Only a few. There's the American Association of Colleges and Universities has had a long-standing project now to develop rubrics which are widely used around the country now to evaluate primarily gen ed types of outcomes, institutional level outcomes, things like written communication, oral communication, critical thinking, information fluency, those types of outcomes. And I think you have a modified version of their global learning is what you're using for service learning here in the college. That's where that came from. At least it was a reference that was used to help build that rubric that you have in place for service learning. Those are very popular rubrics, and they're extremely well designed for some reasons that I'll talk about a little bit later on. But when you're evaluating gen ed, especially at very large institutions, what often happens is you're randomly selecting written artifacts from different gen ed courses and then trying to evaluate them using that rubric for written communication, the AAC value rubric. And what a lot of institutions are discovering is they're getting artifacts that don't contain all the information they need to be able to evaluate all of the criteria in that rubric. So if you don't have that good articulation, you're going to have that disconnect, and that creates some assessment challenges. So the argument, therefore, is for these signature assessments, you're in a much stronger position if you use directed artifacts. You have clear instructions on what it is that's going to be assessed. Those instructions need to be well articulated so that you know that the rubric and the instructions for the assignment are well aligned, so that if the student follows the instructions, you'll have everything you need to have to comprehensively assess the outcome. So directed artifacts, for me, is a much bigger deal. We made that mandatory at UCF. There's lots of place for self-selected artifacts in the educational process. These key signature assignments, not the best place for those types of things. You need to make sure, again, that you're comprehensively addressing everything. And you want your formative assessments well articulated with your summative. It's not just that you're evaluating the same competencies, but once you've identified those critical indicators, you need to use the same critical indicators on the formative and the summative assessments for that competency. We had a situation, again, where I worked, where that articulation wasn't there. The same competency was being assessed formatively and summatively, but different indicators being used. So now what do you do when someone fails they pass the formative, they fail the summative? Would you have ever had an indication that they were not on track for a particular critical indicator if you didn't look at that as part of the formative assessment? So you can see how that can become a disconnect. You have to have that articulation. So there's a great article that was written by Peter Ewell, one of the nationally renowned assessment experts. He wrote this one specifically for CAPE, for data used in their accreditation process. He talked about 10 different qualities of good measures, but this is a great article to read. It's available on the CAPE website. It's only about 4.5 pages long. Gives you a brief paragraph summary of what each of these things really means. I'll talk to you about just a few of those, not all of them. Validity and reliability, extremely important. Validity, there are a lot of different aspects of validity when you're talking about key assessments. Construct validity is, are you assessing the right stuff? Content validity is, are you assessing all the important components of that right stuff? So that's where you get into that issue of, you've got the competency, you've got to identify those critical indicators. You have concurrent validity, which is, you don't ever want to use a single source of information to determine whether a student is somewhere that student needs to be, or a program is making a case that it is doing what it's supposed to do. It talks to that cumulativeness, it's related to that. You want multiple ways to be sure that a student or a program is on track. And the one that's sometimes the most difficult for folks is predictive validity. So if you identify your key assessments, the question becomes, do students who do well on those ultimately do well when they're on the job after they've left your program? Can you show that there's a correlation between what you think is important when they're going through the program and what really matters when they get out on the job? So this is an interesting challenge for all of us. Obviously, you've got to have some longitudinal data, and you've got to have a way of tracking your program completers, your graduates into the field. You're already collecting data from employers, I believe, surveys, so that's a good source of indirect data that can help you make a case for that type of predictive validity. Reliability is also a big deal. The one you hear about all the time is inter-rater reliability. So if you have multiple faculty using the same key assessment because you have more than one section of a course, are you getting good, consistent results in that? But there's another component of this. It's called intra-rater reliability. When you go home at night and you've got 20 papers to grade, you may not be quite as effective doing that 20th one as you were doing the first one because you may be a little bit more tired, whatever. We all know that we don't operate at exactly the same level at all times. Rubrics will help you with both of those, inter and intra-rater reliability. What accountability agencies will always look to is the inter-rater reliability because that one's easy to get data and figure it out. The intra is really for your own internal comfort, knowing that you can do a more consistent job evaluating your students' performance. Representativeness is, if you're presenting data and it's not all the data for a particular construct, can you make a strong case that it is representative of the population for which you're presenting the data? So when you do surveys, if you don't get 100% response rate, and you're not surveying 100% of the target population, one of the things you always have to do is talk about sample size, response rates, those types of things, so you can make that case for representativeness. You want to make sure that the data do represent whatever program, whatever outcome you're talking about. Benchmarking is becoming more and more important, and I'm going to come back to that when I talk about institutional effectiveness assessment because it's an important way to raise the bar on what you're doing in that regard. And then actionability we need to talk about because I have a personal opinion that most faculty, and there are a lot of faculty who don't like to talk about assessment, don't want to be actively engaged in the type of assessment that we're discussing, which is those key assessments for accountability purposes or for accreditation purposes. They feel like that's being laid on top of what they normally do. It's an add-on. It doesn't need to be that way. And part of that deal is they're always told to do what with the data? Have that assessment data, what are they supposed to do with it?
Analyze
And then do what?
it.
Act on it.
Make changes.
Make changes, okay? There's an awful lot of bad assessment data being collected out there right now. And faculty are generally pretty bright, pretty dedicated people who generally want to do well by their students and by their programs. But if you give a faculty bad data, which they can immediately see has no utility for them, and then you say, you're required to use this for program improvement, you're going to get a lot of resistance very fast. And it may be passive aggressive, it may be very, very obvious. But we as a profession are very guilty of that. We give faculty bad data and then say, do something useful with this to improve student learning, to improve the quality of your program. So what you want your rubrics, your key assessment instruments to generate on top of everything else that we've talked about is actionable data, something that's meaningful. The biggest naysayer that I had in the college of education when I was at UCF trying to convince faculty to get actively engaged in continuous quality improvement work, had a senior professor in our educational leadership program there who insisted, and he was the program director, program coordinator was the term we used, which made it all the more difficult because he was not setting a good example. He insisted that institutional effectiveness assessment for continuous quality improvement was a waste of his time because they already had a good program and they didn't need to make any changes. And their students were doing well, et cetera, et cetera. I could not convince him otherwise. So one of the things that we had in Florida was all of the programs had to pass any applicable state certification exam as a graduation requirement if it was a state-approved program, which all of our programs were. So what do you think the pass rate was on that exam, the overall program level pass rate? By definition, 100% had to be. So that's all he knew. He said, we have 100% pass rate on the certification exam, we're wowing everything. We don't need to do anything any differently or any better. What he didn't know is how many of their students were passing on the first attempt. So I pulled the data out of the state database and I gave him that information. and showed him what his first attempt pass rate was for his program and what the average number of attempts to pass, what that mean number of attempts to pass was for his program. Well, that at least got his attention. Then I gave him sub-score data for the exam, so he could look competency by competency at what was going on and what percentage of all the questions on each version of the exam pertaining to a particular competency his students were getting correct. And I aggregated the data for an entire academic year. Everybody in the program who took the exam and what those numbers looked like. And when he looked down and he saw a couple of specific competencies where that score was less than 60% correct, unbeknownst to himself, he immediately jumped in. He says, we gotta do something about that. We gotta do something about that. We can tweak this curriculum. I know a project we can add in this course to fix this problem. And I just looked at him and smiled. He said, what are you smiling about? And I immediately said, welcome to the dark side. He learned immediately that this process is useful if you can see actionable data. Faculty will react to actionable data. If you can give them something meaningful for the program that they know will, if they can do something positive, will help their students and will improve the quality of the program, I've not yet met a faculty member that wouldn't embrace that. So the trick here is getting to actionable data, really important. External benchmarks, again, important. Internal benchmarks is the one that I'd like to talk just a minute about, because when you do continuous quality improvement, one of the things that we learned at UCF, and now I'm taking off my college hat and putting on my university hat, sitting on that assessment committee, we learned that the way to make this process really work is when you collect data, you see an opportunity to do something better, you initiate a change. Don't stop there. If you really want to close the loop, you need to do a couple of things. When you initiate that change, establish a benchmark. How much improvement are you looking for? So, the example I just gave you on those sub-score exams, we set a benchmark that said, we're going to do some things, and when we look at these data next year, we want that percentage of correct responses to go from below 60 to at least 80%. So we set target learning outcome. It gives you something to measure yourself against. The one thing you don't want to do is get hung up on whether or not you meet the target. And don't set a target just because you know you're going to be able to meet it. That's a useless exercise, okay? Set a zealous target. I called it, the term I used was a stretch goal. Something that you know will really make a significant improvement for your students if you get there, okay? Set that 80%. Now in that case, if they came back the next year and looked at the data and it was 75%, what do you do with that? You say, good job, because that's a whole lot better than under 60%. And then you have that conversation about, okay, are we done yet? Are we satisfied with 75? Do we want to do something else and go after an even higher result next year? Or do we change our attention and go to something else that's a higher priority for the next year? So this whole process of continuous improvement should be dynamic, and it doesn't have to look across the full spectrum of a program every year. And again, you've got a structure in place that already is doing that. You're looking at different components of your programs on a 2-year cycle, if I remember correctly. So you're already kind of in that mindset, but you have to take a look at where you are each year and what you're doing and make sure that then you go forward in the appropriate way. The next thing you have to do to close the loop is collect data again and see what impact your change had. Did it have the desired outcome? And you're not really done until the answer to that question is yes. Then you really close the loop. And I'll show you a cycle that I think is the complete cycle for continuous quality improvement. So actionability we've talked about. There's a continuous quality improvement cycle. This cycle's been around for a long time, with the exception of the 5th stage that I added in there and then modified. I had to integrate in about 10 years ago at UCF because we almost never made major program changes based solely on assessment data. Our national standards changed periodically, our state standards changed routinely. Research in our field is going on and informing our practice all the time. Faculty are interacting. I was in educator preparation primarily. They're out in the schools all the time. What's going on in the schools is changing. That has an impact on how and what we need to teach. We had to integrate all that information before we made major decisions about program change. So I added that integrate stage. Recently, I added the evaluate piece to that because there's so much emphasis now on the quality of data. It's not enough to just analyze the data. You've got to make sure the data are really high quality data before you want to act on it. So I've added that fifth stage now and tweaked it. I say evaluate and integrate. So you plan for continuous improvement, you measure the results, you analyze the data, you evaluate and integrate from other sources of information. You have a board of visitors that probably provides some advisory input to you, lots of other sources of information that should be part of that overall process. You make the change, and then you build into the revised version of your plan collection of data to evaluate the efficacy of that change or those changes that you're implementing so that you know whether or not they have the desired effect. And this is ongoing. It's a continuous cycle. When I first took over as chair of the University Assessments System, or committee at UCF, we had a checklist that we used to evaluate. There were 2 formal submissions annually for every degree granting program in the college, in the university rather, and every major academic unit. We had about 310 total participants in this, formal participants in this process. We eventually added institution centers and some other pieces. Gen Ed did its own direct plan every year. So we had a scale, and the scale wasn't a very good scale. It had different types of elements in it. Some were just kind of qualitative labels, good, excellent. Others were mild improvement, significant improvement. Well, what if you were good last year, you had significant improvement, and now you're excellent? Which label do you put on it, excellent or significant improvement? They weren't even mutually exclusive. The scale was horrible. So I didn't like what I was looking at, and the other thing the scale didn't do, which a good rubric will do, is it provided no information to participants as to what does that mean? What does excellent look like? What does good look like? That's one thing that rubrics will do for your students, by the way. A well-designed rubric is an amazing learning scaffold for students. They need to know, what do I need to do to be rated as performing at this particular level? So that's what we did here. We basically said there's a certain set of key components of, in this case, an IE assessment plan. There are certain characteristics that we have to see. By the way, the maturing was considered the minimally acceptable level of performance. And all we did was we identified the 6, if you will, non-negotiable, every program, every academic unit, we got to see this or you're not where you need to be as an absolute minimum. So if you're getting 4 or 5 of those, but not all 6, you're emerging. If you're getting 1 through 3, you're beginning. If you don't turn in a plan at all and you're supposed to, you got a 0. So there's actually another performance level on this scale. And the interesting thing here, to encourage this higher level performance, is the way we built, we had this in a home-built electronic system, web-based system. When you first went in as an evaluator, as a committee member, to look at a plan that was submitted, the only active buttons were 1 through 6. And you had to click on all of those before 7, 8, and 9 would even activate. So somebody might be doing 7 and 8, but if they're only doing 5 of the first 6, they're not going to get credit for doing 7 and 8. So that's why we were very clear about the critical indicators, the must-sees. That's 1 through 6. No negotiation there. Okay, you got to be doing that. And then we had some additional levels. So if you're doing 7, you're doing the first 6 and 7 or 8, you're accomplished. If you're doing the first 8 plus 9, you get to that ultimate stage. We had a similar, and there's an accompanying narrative for each of those, and I'm not going to go through that, but I left a copy of this information. These slides are here, so you'll have them. This is what the IE assessment results report rubric looked like. There were only 8 indicators here, and realistically, not all programs can get past maturing. A brand new program really can't do a whole lot because if you've not collected data yet, it's kind of hard to get to 7 where you're assessing the impact of changes. You haven't made any changes yet. If you're in your first year, you're establishing a plan. And then at the end of the year, you're going to report the plan. And you'll have your results, but it'll be the following year before you'll have any data pertaining to a change implemented at the end of year 1. And until you have those data, you won't know whether you had the desired output. So it may take you a couple of years, even if you're doing everything right, to get to the end game here. But everybody can do the first 6. even from day one. So we put these rubrics in place, and the nice thing, what I liked about this is now everybody knew what it took to get rated at a certain level, and they had a much clearer idea of what we wanted this whole process of IE assessment to look like at UCF. When SACS, our regional accreditation agency, saw what we were doing at UCF, we received numerous invitations from SACS to do invited presentations at SACS conferences around the Southeast. They really like this system. And we were collecting a ton of data off of this, which really keeps your regional accrediting body very, very pleased if you've got a good, solid IE assessment process in place. Okay, let's talk about rubrics. This is the heart of it. And the metaphor that I use when I try and focus on rubrics for the bulk of the discussion, the metaphor that I like to share is kind of building an arch. Okay? You've got two important pillars as you're going up and building an arch. You have your assessment system on one side, and what's the base of the assessment system? Establishing those learning outcomes. You already have that in place. And then you're coming up with your key formative and summative assessments and deciding where you're going to do those checks along the way and putting continuous quality improvement processes in place to tap into the data and do useful things with the data. The other arch is the technology that I'm convinced you absolutely have to do this job well today. You have to be efficient as well as effective. So there are lots of good technology systems out there that can help you do this in the most efficient manner possible. So you've got the other arch kind of going up in parallel, trying to build on the technology that you need to support what you're doing. And there's really three components. You've got Banner here, so you've got certain general information about your candidates that you're going to want to have at your disposal to do some of the types of analysis that you may ultimately want to do. You've got your D2L, which is your learning management system. You need a third piece. You need a system that's designed specifically to support the kind of assessment with good back-end analytics that we're talking about. So you get those three pieces in place. And then what holds the arch together? Anybody know the name of the term of that stone, that triangular stone at the center of the top of the arch that holds it all together? The keystone. What's the keystone in this whole process? It's good assessment instruments. I don't care how strong your assessment system is, and I don't care how good your technology support is, if you have bad rubrics in place for your key assessments, the arch will fail. And that's where most of us are most challenged today. Everywhere I go, in the roles that I go in, either as a consultant or as an accreditation official, I see really bad rubrics. And I'm going to share some of what I've observed with you as part of the workshop today. You're going to get to take a look at some of those rubrics and try and figure out what's wrong with these things. Okay. So, we've already talked about how rubrics can be a learning aid for students that also improve the inter and intra-rater reliability. They are that keystone. The big question is, how good are the rubrics that you have in place right now? So I want to talk a little bit about what does an effective rubric really look like, and then I'm going to give you something that I've designed, which I call a meta rubric, and it's a fairly simple one, only 4 criteria, and not too many levels of performance. But it's things that I think if you pay attention to this meta rubric, it's a tool you can use to evaluate how good your rubrics are, or to help you design effective rubrics if you're in the design mode. So we're going to go into a small group activity shortly here. I'm going to hand you out in small groups, examples of, again, extraction rubrics that I've seen at different places, and I just want you to take a look at those. Here are some basic attributes. I've already mentioned that the rubric and the assessed artifact or activity have to be well articulated. I will tell you that if that's not the case, in most situations the problem's not the rubric. If you've done a good job designing the rubric, the problem is the activity or the instructions for the activity or the artifact may be what needs fixing here. Not necessarily. I call it an attribute of an effective rubric. The problem's usually at the front end. It's usually the poor instructions or incomplete instructions for the particular assignment, or the fact that you're using self-selected artifacts or randomly selected examples, those types of things where you don't have that assurance of a good fit. The rubric has to have construct validity. That means it's measuring the right stuff. So most of your program areas have national standards. You pretty much know what those are, so you're gonna have, you want your key critical indicators aligned with the ethical standards where you have those. That's one source. There are two other things that you need to do to make sure that you can make a strong case for construct validity. I've already mentioned one of the others, and that is use your most expert faculty to take the lead on this. Don't undervalue. And my experience going out to institutions and having this conversation is, in many cases, and I hope it's not true here, the most experienced faculty are the ones that really don't want to get engaged in this work. They'd rather somebody else do that because they have other things that are higher priority. And part of that's our own fault. Part of that is because we don't value this work at the level we should in faculty evaluation criteria and in promotion and tenure. So until we fix that in higher ed, we'll probably struggle with this for a long time. But the reality is, if you can convince your senior faculty that if they own this, and one of the things I liked about your plan is you've already said that. You've already acknowledged that, in fact, this is faculty work. Faculty have to do this. This is not something that assessment directors should be responsible for. The heart of the rubric has got to come from people that have the expertise in that field of what's being assessed. So, the third piece, by the way, is get your stakeholders involved up front. Most of us have advisory groups of one form or another, and we generally have good relationships with the working community that we send our graduates into. In some cases, we even ask them to come look at our data and help us figure out what to do with it. In a lot of cases, we may show them our key assessments and say, what do you think? I'm suggesting don't wait till that point, be proactive. Get them to help you design the key assessments. Things happen fast out there in the real work world for all of us. And if we want to stay responsive and make sure that our programs are truly responsive and have the right content, we're covering all the important stuff for our students and doing the best by them, then we'll get those stakeholders engaged very early on in this entire process. You want each criterion in the rubric to assess an individual construct. One of the common problems I see is double or multiple barrel criteria. And one of the biggest dangers of that is you wind up not being able to get the second bullet under performance descriptors. When you have multiple barrels, it's possible to have performance that none of your performance level descriptors will capture. It's real easy to have disconnects. You need to have very concrete and objective distinctions between performance levels and no overlaps. And I see overlaps, and I see descriptors that are honestly nothing more than surrogates for the performance level titles. You get this big long narrative, you've got a performance level that maybe says acceptable and then exemplary. And then you've got this big long performance level that says does X, Y, and Z at an acceptable level. And the descriptor for exemplary is does X, Y, and Z at an exemplary level. What in there is going to help you know what the difference is for grading, or help students know what the difference is from a learning perspective? This is tough work to do this well, to get that concrete distinction between performance levels. Another thing that I see commonly is, quote, a rubric, and I disagree with some people that would still call this a rubric. I have a more narrow definition. A rubric that'll have the list of criteria and then columns, but it's just a grading scale. Very commonly, I see a 5-level grading scale, and all you can go down is you check what level they're at. Well, you've given the student a little bit of help because you've given them a detailed breakout of criteria that are going to be evaluated, but you haven't given them a clue what's different between good and excellent. And very often when that happens is when you're trying to do two things with a single rubric. You're trying to capture performance data, and you're trying to figure out a way to assign a course grade. That 5-level rubric often translates into A, B, C, D, F. And sometimes very explicitly translates. I mean, I've seen the letters in there in addition to the performance level titles. What I would suggest to you is for the key assessment instruments, don't try and do two things with one rubric. Keep this pure. You need rubrics to be able to tell you that you're at, that a student is where we need them to be at a particular formative assessment milestone, a checkpoint, and that they've attained mastery at the end of the program. Another big problem that I see, by the way, is this. And don't worry about the fact that there's no narrative in there. Can you see anything in here that might pose a potential problem? This is the most common rubric template that I run into everywhere I go. And it's a rubric that's designed to evaluate the same criteria at both a key formative assessment, that's the developing column, that's where they're supposed to be there, and at the end of the program, which is a proficient column. It's where they have to be for graduation. Using a single rubric designed this way gives you that assurance that you want of the articulation of formative and summative assessments, because you're looking at exactly the same criteria for the competencies. The problem is that last column. We just love to be able to give some students that A+, don't we? As educators. And students want to get that. When you have that level of performance that exceeds where you need or want your students to be at the end of the program, that creates a myriad of problems. And we'll come back to that because you're going to deal with some of that in the workshop. We'll talk about some of the things that happen when you go there. Very common. Some of the best assessment folks around do this. If your education program has looked at the EdTPA, that big national assessment for educative preparation, they have 3 levels. Mastery, that equate to mastery or beyond. Just every time I think about that, it bothers me. This is a better option if you want to do a 4-level rubric and you've got 2 formative milestones and then where they need to be at the end of the program. That's it. This, by the way, is pretty much what those AAC&U value rubrics look like. One of the things I like about those is the final column is exactly where you expect them to be at the end of the program. They don't try and go past that, which is why I think they're such a good model. And then if you're just going to have one formative, just get rid of that last column. Just take it to mastery. Put whatever label you like on that. If you go to this column, I like using the term target because that's where you want them to be at the end of the program. But the label is not as important as the integrity of the rubrics. Okay, so here's that meta rubric that I told you I created. Only 4 criteria: rubric alignment to the assignment. You won't need to worry about that for what we're going to do today because I'm not giving you the assignment piece. And in fact, in most cases, you're not going to see an entire rubric. You're going to see a single criterion from a rubric because I want you to just be focused on that piece and trying to figure out what's wrong or what's right with this and what might we want to do to improve it, if anything. The comprehensiveness of the criteria is that you're getting all of the key components of a particular competency. Those critical indicators are all present. The 2 criteria that you will look at today during the workshop are the last 2. The integrity of the criteria. Okay? You don't want those multiple barrel criteria, and in a minute I'll show, next row you'll see an example where I've actually got multiple barrel. And then the last one, the quality of indicators, and that is that the performance descriptors are clearly distinct. They're mutually exclusive. They collectively include all possible learning outcomes. If they're distinct, it means you're not using subjective terms to differentiate between performance levels. You're using concrete terms, as objective as you can possibly be. After all, that's the whole purpose of having a rubric. If you're doing an objective test, you don't need a rubric for that. You need a rubric to help you when you're doing grading for an activity or an artifact that is, by definition, a relatively subjective grading process, and what you're trying to do is minimize the subjectivity involved in that grading, that assessment work. So you don't want to use subjective terms, defeats the whole purpose of the rubric. Now, if you look at that last one, you'll see that it violates that principle of double barrel. Okay. But it doesn't violate any other principle. There's no possible outcome here. I was very careful in designing this. There's no possible outcome that's not captured in one of those 3 levels, even though it's double barrel. And one of the other big dangers about double barrels is, and here's the one thing that you would lose, if this were a traditional rubric and you were evaluating a learning outcome in your program, you'd have a problem with the developing level because you would know whether or not a student was there. But if they're at developing, what don't you know? Just from the data that you would pull. If you did an analysis of the resulting data, what would you not know? You wouldn't know which barrel was missing, right? So what does that do to you? It's not actionable. Okay. Well, for this rubric, because this rubric has only one purpose, and that is you're going to have another rubric right by you, and you're going to look at this rubric, and when you're doing that work, if it's at developing, you're going to immediately know which barrel is missing, and you're going to know what you need to fix. So this doesn't violate that principle of actionability because of the way this rubric is used. But most rubrics, that becomes a big problem. You don't have actionability if you know that, you know, one barrel of 2 or 3 or 4 is missing, but you don't know which one, and you don't know what to do about that. So those last 2 are the ones that you'll focus on the workshop. And what I've got is those samples, and I've got, I think, 10 different examples, so we can get in as many as 10 groups, and each group work on one example, and then we'll come back together, and we're going to stay in here because I want to be able to share with everybody all of the different samples so we can have that discussion afterwards, kind of follow up and see what we get out of this workshop. Okay? Anybody have any questions before we hand out the great rubric examples that we're going to get to look at? No questions? Such a quiet group this morning. Okay. It looked like folks were mostly organized in their program areas, so that might be a good way to set up the groups. And I brought 3 copies of each one.